On this video, we're going to be looking at some case studies of mergers and takeovers, some of which have been successful, some of which have been absolute disasters. First one that I want to look at is Disney-Pixar that occurred in 2006 for a price of $7.4 billion financed by equity. Now, the key players at the time were the Disney CEO, a guy called Bob Iger, and the Pixar CEO, Steve Jobs of Apple fame. Now, there was a history between these two companies that Disney used their distribution infrastructure to distribute Pixar films. They actually commissioned films from Pixar, which is all very nice, but occasionally they sued each other. So it was sort of a love-hate sort of relationship. So Iger approached Jobs to take Pixar over, and Jobs responded, "Disney's culture will destroy Pixar. Distraction will kill Pixar's creativity." There were big cultural differences between the two companies. Pixar focused on the creativity of filmmaking, whereas with Disney, have a look at that quote from the Disney artist on the left-hand side. "You don't know what it's like to work for 4 years, put your heart and soul into a film, and the day the film opens, no one mentions it again." So with Disney, their artists tended to take directives from the executives. They had less creative freedom. So it looked as if it was going to be, if it worked, a hostile takeover. However, business is about people, and Iger and Jobs met, and Jobs changed his mind completely. Quote, "What I saw that day left me breathless. The level of talent and creative ambition, the commitment to quality, the storytelling ingenuity, the technology, the leadership structure, and the air of enthusiastic collaboration. Even the building, the architecture itself." That's what Steve Jobs said. He became Disney's biggest shareholder. And key that the person who was responsible for Pixar's success, John Lasseter, became Disney's chief creative officer, and he started to change Disney's culture. So the filmmakers, rather than, if you like, being responsible to the executives, they started to talk to each other as to how they were doing things, and they became a much more open culture where anybody could suggest changes, so changes weren't just imposed from the top down. So was this a successful takeover? You bet it was. Very, very, very successful. Disney essentially gained the expertise of Pixar because of the work of Lasseter. The cultures then started to interact organically, and now you can't really tell the difference between a Pixar film and a Disney film. You can see the two on the left hand side, Toy Story 3 and Cars. Those are Pixar productions, whereas Frozen and Zootopia are Disney productions, but you can't really tell the difference. So they've actually merged incredibly successfully together. It's regarded as one of the best mergers ever. So that was a merge that looked as if it was going to be hostile, but actually they finished up loving each other and being successful. Kraft-Cadbury's in 2010 was straightforward hostile. It cost Kraft $19.5 billion for it, and it was financed by a combination of equity and debt. Now, in August 2009, Kraft offered 740p a share, which valued the company at $16.3 billion, which the board of Cadburys rejected as derisory. Now, potentially you had other confectionery firms interested. For our own Hershey, we're both looking at rival bids. Lots of people wanting Cadbury shares, and so the share price went up through the ceiling. Finally, in January 2010, Kraft made an offer of $8.40 a share, which the Cadbury's board decided to reluctantly accept. So why did Kraft want the company? Well, first of all, to get economies of scale. They'd noticed that Cadbury's performance during the recession was particularly strong. And it was actually the last peg in allowing Kraft to demerge. Kraft wanted to demerge, but they wanted Cadbury to be a strong part of half of that demerge. Well, with Cadbury's being such an iconic company in the UK, Kraft had to make a number of promises to allow that merge to go through. So they promised to keep the Keynsham plant in the West Country open. Remember that they merged in January 2010. By March, they announced that they were going to close it, but they did say they were sorry, so that's all right. In October 2012, Irene Rosenfeld demerged Kraft into a grocery and a snack food part, and Cadbury's joined Mondelez, which was the snack food part that Rosenfeld became the CEO of. Now, another promise that they made was that they were going to continue to be a fair trade company. Cadburys were well known as an ethical company. They were basically originally formed because Joseph Cadbury wanted to employ local people so they wouldn't be unemployed. He had religious convictions. November 2016, they decided they weren't going to work with free trade anymore. So they might have lied just a little bit. It was all right for Ira Rosenfeld though, because in 2014 her salary went up from $9 million to $14 million, which was quite nice for her, so well done. Well, did it work? I'd say that this is one that is difficult to call, primarily because so much has gone on during that time. So you've got a demerge, you've got a lot of other activities, and Cadburys were not the only members, obviously, of Kraft. Kraft, of course, did believe that they needed Cadbury in order for Mondelez to be sufficiently big for a demerge to take place. However, most of the senior Cadbury's executives left within 2 years, and that meant that there was a loss of expertise. Mondelez started to meddle with things that were really vital for Cadbury's success. For example, they changed the Cadbury's cream egg recipe, as a result of which they lost £6 million. However, if you look on the right hand side, just above my head, you can see that their share price has done okay during that time. So was it successful? Don't know. Our next merge is a horizontal merge between British Airways and Iberian Airlines in 2010. Formed a new company, the IAG, which BA was slightly the bigger part, with a worth of £5 billion. So once it says merged, they were the 6th largest airline in the world. Why did they do it? Well, both companies were basically heading for losses, and they wanted to try to get round that, and they needed particularly to compete against low-cost airlines in various continents. Obviously in Europe we've got EasyJet and Ryanair being the leaders. They were able to achieve some cost synergies because there were some overlapping routes that they could scrap. They could say, if there were 2 BA flights to a particular destination and 2 Iberian flights to the same one, well, maybe they could cut that down to 3. But particularly, they were looking for revenue synergies. It gave British Airways access to South America, where they weren't particularly important, and Iberia access to North America, where they weren't particularly important. Again, with such a rapidly changing market, it's difficult to judge whether this was a success. Share price tended to go up. That big crash in 2020 was largely due to COVID, nothing to do with the merger. So now we'll go back to 2000 for what was the world's largest merger ever. $165 billion, that's why I've given it a gold cup, between America Online and Time Warner. At the time, AOL were huge, particularly in the American market, where more than 50% of the domestic internet access market was held by them. They were the dominant online service provider internationally. They had more than 34 million subscribers worldwide, whereas Time Warner were a major film and entertainment company. You've probably heard of Warner Brothers. So why do it? Well, Time Warner would be embracing the digital revolution, whereas AOL, primarily a computer company, would gain something physical, some tangible assets. At the time, Time Warner, quote, would now take off at internet speed accelerated by AOL. Now, there's obvious revenue synergies there, that Time Warner would gain AOL subscribers, whereas AOL would gain the cable network and, of course, the content, those films that they can put over the cable lines. So that was a marriage made in heaven. Couldn't possibly go wrong, except it did. Just 2 years later, AOL-Time Warner reported a loss of $99 billion. Again, enough to get a gold cup, because it is the biggest loss ever recorded in history. The value of the stock fell from $222 billion to a value of $20 billion. Various reasons given for this. Well, first of all, between 2000 and 2002, the dot-com bubble burst. But there were particular problems with culture. Culture is often really important as being a component of failure of mergers. You'll remember that in the case of Pixar and Disney, Pixar changed the culture of Disney. So they embraced what Pixar were doing. But there were big cultural differences in AOL-Time Warner. AOL were regarded as aggressive and arrogant. Time Warner stayed and corporate. The fit just wasn't there. And of course, at the same time, there were big changes in that market. Broadband was developing and subscription internet access was going down. Those factors caused that single biggest loss ever by anyone. So let's go to a friendly takeover in 2013 between Microsoft and Nokia, priced at 7.2 billion. Well, Nokia, Finnish company, formed in 1885. Basically, they were a paper pulper. They moved into electronics. They were a conglomerate by 1967, and they produced their first mobile phone in 1981. By 1998, they had revenues of over $10 billion and a profit over $2.5 billion. They were by far the largest player in the world, 30% global market share, over double the nearest rival, that was Motorola. As for Windows, they had over 90% of the global PC market in 2013. Their problem was that only 3.2% of mobile phones use Windows as their operating systems. And this was a problem for Microsoft because they just spent a lot of money developing Windows Phone 8.1 as their operating system. So this was a classic vertical forwards integration. Operating systems can go on mobile phones. So Microsoft were moving forwards in the production process. And of course, the reason for doing that is that it meant that somebody would be using Windows as the operating system on their phone. They've got a guaranteed outlet. Another disaster. Regarded as the third worst merger in IT ever. AOL-Time Warner was the second. Look up the first. They finished up selling the smartphone division in 2016. No, it's only 3 years after they bought it for $350 million. Remember, they bought it for $7,200 million. And again, you can see the result. This is the latest situation in terms of mobile phone operating systems. Android 72% globally, iOS 27.4%, Windows nowhere to be seen. A disaster. Why? Just because you've got an outlet doesn't mean you've got a customer. You haven't got Windows on your mobiles, I imagine. So let's move to 2012 for the $1 billion friendly takeover of Instagram by Facebook. That was financed by a combination of equity and debt. Now, if we look at Facebook at the time, they had 1 billion active users worldwide. Remember, the population of the world is only about 7 billion people. Up to that point, they hadn't really engaged in mergers, mainly organic growth. They'd never bought anyone for more than $50 million. So what did they pay this $1,000 million for? Basically a startup. Instagram had only been going for 2 years. They only had 13 employees and they had never sold anything. There are various reasons given for that buyout. They were buying out a potential rival, but remember, Instagram had sold nothing at that point. Now, if they did that, and that is currently being investigated, note that headline from December 2020, then they could be subject to antitrust allegations. One other thing that they may have been doing was to acquire the talent in Instagram, those 13 people. They were prepared to pay £1,000 million for them. They were actually very, very worried about rivals. So they were worried about Twitter, which at the time had 100 million users, and Google Plus that also had 100 million users. No, nothing like as big as Facebook with their 1 billion users. And Facebook's other problem was that their mobile apps weren't regarded as particularly good. They were slow and they were regarded as being bloated. So how did it go? Well, pretty well. Instagram are valued at $100 billion. Facebook's total value is $500 billion, or about $500 billion. Facebook certainly uses experience to become much more active on the takeover market, particularly in 2014 when they bought out WhatsApp. And particularly it seems as if they're targeting youth. One of the things that I've noticed as a teacher is that from about 2015, my students don't use Facebook. Facebook is where people like me use it. I use it because my friends use it. Perhaps young people don't use it because their parents use it. So they're currently monetizing Facebook because we've got money, but they're building up for the future by WhatsApp and Instagram. And you can see there in terms of Facebook hits that now we're at over 2.5 million, about 2.8 billion users worldwide, which ain't bad. Now we'll head back to 2000 for a horizontal hostile takeover of the NatWest Bank by the Royal Bank of Scotland. Now the actual process was that in 1999 the NatWest Bank announced a friendly merge with Legal & General, which the city hated. The share price plummeted, and that made NatWest liable for a takeover. So there was initially a hostile bid from the much smaller Bank of Scotland, but the Royal Bank of Scotland countered with again another hostile bid to make it the biggest takeover in UK history, hence that Gold Cup. Now the background of the banks. Well, the NatWest has been around in various forms since 1658 and is and was one of the UK's largest banks. RBS were about a third of the size of NatWest, so it really is a David and Goliath situation. And the guy who became in charge, who engineered the takeover, was a guy called Sir Fred Goodwin, known as Fred the Shred, who after that takeover was made the CEO of RBS. He was known for being brutal on businesses, and he was able to achieve cost synergies by sacking 18,000 people. So how did it go? Well, fantastically. Instantly, the Royal Bank of Scotland became the second largest bank in the UK and Europe, the fifth largest bank globally in terms of shares times share price, the 13th largest company of any sort in the world. Between 2000 and 2002, the share price tripled. In 2006, they were making over £9 billion in profits. And we can award another Gold Cup for them. By 2007, they had a value of $3.77 trillion, and they were the largest bank in the world. Now, my Gold Cups don't tend to stay, do they? 2007, Sir Fred headed a consortium to buy a bank called ABN AMRO for $55 billion, of which RBS were going to cough up $10 billion. It was financed with debt, so they were borrowing money to do it. They didn't bother particularly to look into the company. What they didn't know was that ABN AMRO was heavily exposed to the US subprime mortgage market, which was one of the biggest reasons that caused the global credit crunch and the financial crisis of that year. So in 2008, RBS announced their first loss for 40 years, and what a loss. £29 billion, the largest ever loss made in the UK, the 9th largest loss ever made by any firm in the world, so we're giving them a Gold Cup for the UK. By 2017 in total, they had lost £58 billion. Have a look at that share price drop. So the share price was worth over £60 in February 2007. Less than 2 years later, £1.21. So if you had 1,000 shares, they would have been worth £60,000, and they've gone down to about £1,200. The company had to be bailed out by the government, or else it would have gone bankrupt. There was a phone call to the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time that basically said, give us money or by lunchtime we're going to be out of business. And as for Fred, the guy responsible for the biggest loss in any institution in the UK, well, they took away his knighthood and gave him a pension of £250,000 a year. Poor soul. Our final merge takes us to 2018 and it's going to cost us £3.9 billion. It was a friendly takeover of Costa by Coca-Cola. They bought them from Whitbread, who basically were happy to demerge, not because they didn't like their performance, but because they felt that they were not getting the best out of Costa that they could, and so they were not doing a good deal for their shareholders. So what about Costa? Well, Costa is the UK's largest coffee seller, twice as big as Starbucks, 4 times bigger than Cafe Nero. One of the problems is that they felt as if they were hitting saturation point in the UK. Now, as for Coca-Cola, one of their biggest strengths is their global distribution network, but their weaknesses, very dependent on carbonated drinks, and demand for carbonated drinks is falling. They had no coffee in their range, and demand for coffee worldwide is rising. So there was an opportunity. There's growing income-led coffee demand. If you look at that map just above my head, that pink area is an area where the main driver for an increase in coffee value is rising incomes. Just to pause a bit, the light green bits are premierisation. In other words, they're getting more value from the coffee, so that's where the UK is. The dark green bits are where there are soft drivers, and the blue bits are where population growth is primarily feeding the rising coffee demand. So the opportunity for Costas was to use the growing income, particularly in Asia. So the solution, they've got a strength in global distribution, especially in India and China, where there's a product that is rapidly growing in demand. Will it work or not? Too early to say. So that's 8 mergers or takeovers and lots of different reasons as to why they may have succeeded or failed.